All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Learn at Lunch webinar. Today, we will hear from Extension economist Phil Kinkle, Courtney Burr, and Rodney Holcomb as they discuss economic disruption to the agribusiness sector. If you have questions, please ask them in the chat window, which may be found by clicking the chat button at the bottom of the screen. For more information on farm management, visit the eFarm Management website, and I will share this link in the chat window. Dr. Kinkle, I will turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Brett. Let me get my screen shared here. Okay, hope that's up.
Yes.
Good. So I'm going to talk about the agribusiness sector, and I'll apologize ahead of time. I'm going to focus down a little bit because that's a really big topic. So when we talk about agribusiness, really, if you look at the definition, it's everything that's in the food and fiber supply chain. So it's everything really, including production, but we usually separate that out all the way through what happens before and after the farm gate, and really flows right into food processing and food service and some things that Rodney and Courtney will be talking about. So, certainly inputs and everything supporting our crop and livestock. Of course, it'd be farm equipment, all our commodity handling and processing, cattle feeding sector, and really even our integrated feeding and processing operations, of course, livestock harvest, and then again would flow into the food service. And I'm sure there's things that I haven't listened to mention there. So it's a big sector, and it would be tough to describe all the impacts in all of those. I think usually when we talk about impacts on agribusiness, we talk about commodity agribusiness. And so we're thinking about what's happening at the farm level, but what's happening also that's kind of related to the farm level. And so certainly everything on the farm supply side, the fuel, the fertilizer, the feed, the crop production products that all go into that. But then there's all the services that go along with that. So those same entities and others are providing crop scouting, they're providing agronomy advice. A lot of times they're applying the fertilizer and the crop protecting the products. We also have fertilizer manufacturing in state, and of course we're bringing in fertilizer not only by truck but also by rail and by barge, and those are big operations. And then if you think what we do with our commodities, of course there's grain marketing, grain storage. We have grain rail shipping, not only at the small scale but at the unit train, the 110 car level. We ship out by barge. Of course, you've got livestock sale operation, cotton ginning and related activities. We cotton seed marketing, cotton bale warehousing. So we've got a lot going on what I would call kind of commodity, both inputs and outputs. I'm going to focus in a little bit just because this is my specialty, but if we talk about cooperatives, they basically are in all of those commodity services. And so I'm not suggesting that non-cooperative firms are not impacted just as much as cooperatives, but this is I think a good way maybe to get a handle on it, and ones that I've got some actual input from and data from. And so certainly they're involved in grain marketing and grain storage, in grain rail load out. We don't have any barge terminals that are purely cooperative, but the existing cooperatives certainly do ship out by barge. On the farm supply side, they've got agronomy services. Of course, they warehouse fertilizer, apply fertilizer. They're both in feed manufacturing and feed sales. They're in cotton ginning and associated services like module hauling. We don't actually crush cotton seed in state anymore, but they're processing cotton seed, and we've got big rail out operations. Cotton bale warehousing and marketing. And so in Altus, sometimes there's over 1 million bales of identity preserved cotton in there, and that's still owned by the farmer. But the cooperative warehouse is handling and loading all those on a bale by bale basis. And so one thing that's I think particularly impactful here is that all those cooperatives are owned by the farm. And so there's two impacts there, both the member may be impacted by services, what happens in the operation, but of course all those costs that we're going to talk about flow right back to the farmers. So off subject here, but I know the real utility co-ops say they've got $35 million of unpaid bills where they have decided not to turn off electricity. on the one hand, you say, well, that's great that they aren't terminating people's electricity service, but you also think that's $35 million that's being picked up by other REC members. And so you have the same issues here on when we think about these costs, that they're flowing, right back down to the farmer member. So, of course, at the farm supply, the retail level, of course, just like everybody else, they've complied with CDC regulations and recommendations, and they've closed their lobbies. They've tried to limit the contact with customers. They've got more sanitation, got some people moving remotely. And of course, that's created a whole bunch of challenges, but some of those challenges is by communicating and providing advice and recommendation. And so most of these are very hands-on operations, and people came there for a discussion about what material, crop protectant, and what are the things that they needed. And so it has been a challenge to now do that with less direct contact. And we really have, two crises going on there, particularly at the retail level, because all the oil and gas activity has also dried up. And so there was tremendous amount of fuel sales and equipment service that was going on for the oil field. And of course, that's also been declined. And so that's hitting those farm supply businesses. Human resource impacts are just very hard to even describe, but are very, very complex questions. Is someone on sick leave? When does the Family Medical Leave Act occur? Is there special leave for coronavirus? What if I'm deciding who works remotely? Can I consider age? And the human resource people say, no, legally you can't consider age when you consider who's remotely, because that would be age discrimination. Can I require someone that's traveled on their own to self-quarantine? No, you cannot legally require a employee to do that, although that would be a big help for the safety of your workplace and customers. Can I require someone to take a coronavirus test if I'm curious or if I'm worried? No, you can't. Legally, they say you cannot require someone to take a physical. Can I take the temperature of my employees when they get there? The answer is maybe. They're not sure whether that's a physical or not. And then on the other hand, you've got OSHA saying you have an absolute responsibility of protecting everyone in your workplace. And so you've got a lot of these compliance issues that are really at cross purposes. And so it's very, very difficult to figure out how you can comply with everything. And of course, the question is, if somebody gets sick at work, is that a work-related injury and falls under workers' compensation insurance, or is that just something that happens? And so huge, huge, huge human resource issues there with no easy answers. Cooperatives tend to have a very lean workforce structures, and when we say we've got more sanitation and we're doing things different ways, that's pretty difficult when you've only got a few people. And when you've got the person remotely that was maybe entering the books, but they were also interacting with customers, then it's hard for them to do both those functions remotely. You think of the restricted travel and the closure of the state and federal offices. So now it's hard for employees to get in training on grain safety, on pesticide application, grain grading, and then, how can they train and test for commercial driver's license? So, some of that's beginning to reopen, but that's huge issues. And then, of course, what if the region of the insurance cooperative was trying to have regional safety meetings, and some employees didn't say they felt like they were comfortable even going to a small group safety meeting regionally. And so that puts the agribusiness in a very tough situation, because OSHA requires that everybody be adequately trained, and you got to document and show that training. And yet sometimes it's hard to do that if people can't travel to some of that training. And even though Kim Anderson did a great job with the virtual grain grading, but for safety and grain grading and some of these issues, it's just hard to get the same level of training when it used to be hands-on. And people actually doing things now, we're trying to do that virtually. So lots of human resource impacts. Of course, on the commodity marketing side, the grain prices, have reduced our pressure on our grain charges. It's also the same communication challenges. People are used to coming in and talking about their marketing options. Just as an aside, the Cooperative Council, a little time back, they said we were short 10,000 grain dust respirators just for the grain operations, not for COVID-19 necessarily. And so, some of these things become big numbers. And of course, the cotton ginning warehouses and the cotton warehouse, they rely on usually a non-U.S. workforce. So if those ginning crews and those warehouse crews can't get here, that'll be a huge issue later on. And, governance has been a big issue. They're not able to have their annual meetings, and that's mandated in their bylaws. And then, of course, a lot of the bylaws, they've not yet modernized for online voting, and so you really can't switch to online voting without having a face-to-face meeting to approve it. Their board of directors are trying to do virtual meetings, and of course that raises issues about proof of quorum and voting and data security, and of course just are you getting the same level of due diligence. And then again, I think most importantly, most members kind of rely on a face-to-face communication to stay up to date, and they feel like they have the ability to express their opinions. And a lot of those older members are not very technically savvy or are used to an online presence, and so that two-way communication, I think, has been a huge travel, and that maybe is a unique to the cooperative side. Of course, on the finance side, we've got less grain handling and storage margins. We're talking about operational cost. We've got more delinquent accounts because the members' financial condition is declining due to job losses, furloughs, and other stuff that's going on. And all of those costs are ultimately borne by the farmer owners. And so, again, I like a lot of what's happening at the agribusiness sector is kind of an extension of what's happening at the farm sector, but it all flows through, and it's both the challenges of meeting those farmer needs, and also, of course, all these additional costs in case of cooperatives at least flow back to the farmers. So that's kind of an overview of some of the issues kind of at the commodity agribusiness level, and I'll pass it on to Courtney.
All right, let me see if I can get this screen share. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes, we can see it.
So I'm going to give kind of a broad overview of some of the impacts that COVID has had on the ag supply chain, and give one example for one kind of easy commodity that's already had a resolution. So when you think about the immediate response to COVID, of course, in a span of just a few days, all of the restaurants, most of the restaurants closed, at least for in dining. Even those that stayed open, a lot of people chose not to go out to eat. And so there was this huge shift from out-of-home eating to in-home eating. So people went from spending 54% of their food budget on food away from home to about 15%. So that was a huge difference that really kind of happened overnight. And so when you think about that and how that impacts ag and prices and everything down that line, think about what you choose in a restaurant versus what you eat at home. So are you going to have a bowl of soup and a salad and an entree and a dessert? Are you going to make all of those things at home? Probably not. One of my favorite examples to think about is parsley. When was the last time you made dinner at home and put your steak on a bed of parsley or a bed of arugula or something like that? So there was a huge shift not only in where people were eating, but what they were eating. So if you think about the changes that you made in your own home and then multiply that across everyone, that's a really huge shift in demand. So all of these disruptions are happening for all of the products. I'm going to talk about eggs today. Eggs are not really a huge, commodity in Oklahoma, but it's a great example because they've actually had some resolution in the egg supply chain. So the egg consumption, just like everything else, shifted from eating at restaurants to eating at home. And we could argue if there was also a slight increase in demand for egg consumption. Eggs are something that are very easy for people to cook. A lot of people were having to YouTube and learn how to cook at home and things like that. So there's kind of this double-edged sword here of perhaps egg consumption actually increased alongside people eating eggs from home. So when you think about eggs and looking at what a restaurant would have versus what you buy at home you get that cute little carton, there's 12 eggs in there, maybe a 24 pack. Restaurants get eggs on a huge pallet. So that's one big difference. So how these items are packaged is different. Then you go beyond convenience. So eggs that you buy in the store have strict packaging requirements. They also have to have nutrition information printed on the label. and there are additional regulations to prevent salmonella. So basically, they don't really trust that you're going to cook that egg correctly and handle it correctly at home. So there's additional cleaning procedures done to limit salmonella contamination. Restaurant eggs have completely different packaging. They're sold in large flats, or they're often sold as liquid. So a lot of times those eggs are already cracked, and the restaurant gets a big carton of cracked eggs, like liquid egg versus individual eggs. So there really wasn't a way to flip the switch and take all of those eggs that were going to restaurants and then put them in the store. The same is true for all of these products. So steaks are packaged differently in the store versus at home, or I'm sorry, in the store versus for restaurant use. Lettuce, cheese, all of these things are having the same issue at the same time. So they had a temporary solution for eggs very quickly. So the FDA allowed for the relaxation of the rules that flats could be sold in stores. So a lot of people heard anecdotal evidence of going to the store and buying maybe 40 eggs at a time now on these flats. And they actually changed some of that regulation regarding the labeling as well, so that the distributor and safe handling requirements had to be on display, but not on the actual carton. And with certain criteria, the additional salmonella precautions were no longer needed for these eggs. So because the FDA moved quickly with eggs, and it was a little bit easier than live animals, you know, changing slaughtering rules, changing that kind of packaging, they were able to fix their supply chain issues much quicker than other products. So issues faced by other livestock products can be a little bit more complicated. So there are strict inspection rules regarding meat products. Those are probably unlikely to change between the retailer versus in store to make that process happen quicker. But we'll have to watch and see what the FDA does. The COVID cases in the packing plants is another big issue. So Guyman, which is a seaboard pork plant, at this point, when I checked yesterday, roughly a quarter of their workers tested positive. No one is exactly sure why the spike in COVID cases happens at these plants. Some of it may be the temperature in these meat processing plants. COVID likes cold. So that may be a contributing factor. The distance that people have to stand between each other when processing these animals may be a factor, as well as personal choices of the workers, lifestyle choices, living choices, things like that. So no one's exactly sure why these spikes are happening, but we are seeing it in a lot of different processing plants. Cattle slaughter temporarily fell by 32% at one point, which is huge. So some of the solutions, no one has a catch-all solution. They're continuing to develop safety protocols for workers. There's been a lot of study, about the plexiglass, making sure that there's not fraternization between different shifts of workers to try and decrease cross-contamination between groups of workers. And no one knows if the at-food home consumption will become a new trend. A lot of people, I think, have realized that they've been spending a lot of money eating out. I know I realized that my grocery bill went up, but overall I was spending less money on food. And as people have been forced to learn how to cook and cook different products, some of those trends may become permanent. So looking forward, watching those trends and seeing what cuts of meat or products people have a new interest in will be really interesting going forward. And then we will have to continue to evaluate and adjust trends as needed. I don't think there's going to be one long-term solution. I think it's going to be several small solutions, like the FDA changing those rules temporarily, that will help us keep our supply chain going. So that's what I have for that. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Holcomb.
So I'm trying to figure out how to unmute Dr. Holcomb on the call-in. Sorry about that. There we are. All right, there you are, Dr. Holcomb. I think you're unmuted.
All right. Yes, sounds like I am. Can you hear me okay, Brent?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Hopefully everybody else can as well. Sorry about that. I'm in a secret undisclosed location, and in the middle of Dr. Kinkle's presentation, I lost all signal, so I'm joining by phone now. Brent's going to run through my slides for me, but I'll talk as we go through them. I'm going to build on a little bit of what Courtney was talking about and what Phil had mentioned as well, and talk about things we've been trying to figure out. What does this mean just for Oklahoma by itself? Some of us over at the Food and Ag Product Center, ever since this whole thing happened, have been in regular contact with food manufacturers in Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Grocers Association, and the Oklahoma Restaurant Association, just to try to figure out what is happening to the industry in the state. So I'm going to tip my hat to Chuck, Andrea, and Aaron for helping with this, and then we'll go to the next slide, talking about Oklahoma's food industry sectors. And unlike the big circle of agribusiness, I'm just really going to talk about food, but even in that, it's pretty complex because you got the food processors, and that'll be your manufacturers, but also your beverage companies as well. But you can't overlook retail and how this impacts the supermarkets, the grocery stores, convenience stores get lumped in there as well. Dollar Generals, they're going to get included in that as well. And then this big monster called food service, because food service is going to include everything from Ishans and Okarche to your nearest Starbucks, because food and beverage get lumped in together, and a lot of them overlap. So while most people may think of Eskimo Joe's as a nice bar that serves burgers, in the eyes of the Census Bureau, it's a restaurant that also happens to serve alcohol as well. So Brent, if you go to the next slide, just looking on the best data we have for 2019 for Oklahoma, food manufacturing employed almost 18,000 people and had over $710 million in payroll. And food and beverage stores, 21,000, and then about 484 million in payroll. But that food service establishment, that's the giant number because it does include everyone. So when we start looking at what this closure has meant to so many different industry sectors in Oklahoma, we got to kind of take a look at all three of them. So next slide, just on the food processing side, if we look at all the activities that have taken place, this whole pandemic has been a unique experience for the food industry, because when we first started out, the food industry as essential business activity, doors didn't close, people were stockpiling food items, and as we reached out to manufacturers in Oklahoma, both large and small, what FAPSI was finding out was that everybody was running full steam ahead, doing absolutely everything they could. And obviously that's changed a little bit. As Courtney was pointing out, we went from 54% of the consumer's food dollar going to food service down to about 15%. That's very similar to what we saw in 2009 or 2008 going into 2009, that recession that we had then. The food processors that were making products for both retail and food service sales, they didn't see a big disruption in business. Those that were primarily making products that would have gone to food service, big hit to their business. So that's the kind of thing we've seen on as well. As time has passed, we've seen labor-intensive manufacturers see this big impact. Courtney mentioned something about the beef industry. This has been an interesting factor. One of our colleagues at OSU is a good hunting buddy with the human resources director at Tyson's big packing plant outside of Amarillo that kills about 1.5 million head of cattle a year. And he said originally they were running just full steam. Then all of a sudden you had people that got worried about getting sick and decided they were not coming in. Had a lot of people that said, given working in cold conditions, cutting up meat, I think I'll stay home, take unemployment, and that $600 extra. And that created a big problem for them. I have another industry contact that works a lot in the big plants in Kansas that said, taking a plant that goes from 400 head an hour and cutting it back to 200 head an hour in the last month has been a big problem. And they've had a little over half of all the COVID cases in Kansas have been associated with Garden City, Dodge City, and Liberal. So where you have your big beef packing plants, that's been a huge problem. So all those big beef packing margins that everyone was talking about, how much money the packers were making, how the cattle producers were getting taken advantage of with these price swings back in March and February, that's gone away. Because when you got the full overhead cost, but you're only producing at half capacity at best, big problem. So next slide, as we look at food processing impacts just for Oklahoma, we looked at what we could find just through the State Department of Ag, Food, and Forestry and surveys they had done and made in Oklahoma Coalition Manufacturers. And
Brent, I think you're one slide ahead of him, actually.
Okay, should be on food processing impacts. So we were trying to take a guess, and obviously this is speculative at best because so many things have changed with where we were at the beginning of this pandemic, where everybody was still working full capacity, where they've dropped back since then, and then the impacts of things like the Paycheck Protection Program and the economic injury disaster loans. What have they have done to these businesses? But we were looking at a pretty big impact, more than 3,600 lost jobs and 115 million just in payroll. That's direct, but also indirect and induced, especially you start looking at impacts on trucking and transportation. The next slide, going on to the food retail overview. Oklahoma Grocers Association has said, we're really having a hard time figuring out. They did a survey of their members just to find out what was happening to the stores. You saw a lot of cutbacks early on. They made a lot of other concessions. They were trying to manage the number of people in stores and try to deal with the shortage of supplies because everyone was stockpiling, really supplying the bunkers to hide out during this whole pandemic. But as we've gone through this, we've seen stores go back into operations, but depending on where you're at in the state of Oklahoma, you may have different local regulations that are impacting what you do and how you do it. So we have some stores that are still operating with limited customer numbers. We have some stores that have mask requirements and other sanitation steps that they're having to deal with because the city has required it or because upper level administration has required it. We've seen the change in the enter and exit points, and if you're like me, you walk through Walmart and curse those directional aisles. So that has had some impact. Oklahoma Grocers Association said this has been a problem based on the best numbers we could get. Our speculative guess was that we've lost over 2,500 jobs just because of cutbacks and over 60 million reduction in payroll, not just direct, but also the indirect and induced. Now, we've seen a switch since then, and you see this in the manufacturing sector as well. We got a lot of people saying, we're hiring, we need people. Well, the reason they're hiring is because they've had so many people say, we won't come back, or we don't feel comfortable coming back. So they're holding out. And so it's an odd trade-off that you rarely, if ever, see in an economic setting, where we've got a shortage of employees and you're trying to hire them, but people won't come in because they feel the risks of contracting COVID-19 are too high. Plenty of stories from the beef packing plants about that as well. Now going to the next slide about the food service overview, this is where we've seen the biggest issue take place. It's a huge challenge because of the social distancing mandates. The food service sector, except for possibly tourism and recreation. So think of tourism sites, concert venues, the BOK Center, the Ford Center, NBA, all of that. They got hit pretty hard, but food service has been hit very hard. They mitigated some of that with the takeout and home delivery as ways to get around it. But the Oklahoma Restaurant Association's early April survey, after everything hit in March, their early April survey had some horrible news for the industry. Just among Oklahoma Restaurant Association members, they said they've laid off over 19,000 employees, furloughed over 21,000, and just totally terminated and did away with over 18,000 jobs and had a little over 3,600 remaining employees. Now, we've started to see some coming back from that, but we're still uncertain what's actually happened to employees that have returned to work, even with these phased openings. The economic impacts of that, like we said, because of PPP and the idle programs, it's been hard to decipher what the true impacts were. But as some restaurant owners have pointed out, just talking to some restaurant managers in Stillwater, yeah, I can be open and I can have people back in my dining room, but I've got the full cost of operating my restaurant with half the revenue generating opportunities because only half my tables are available. So that becomes a big challenge. So if you go to the next slide, Brent, the food service impacts, that's been the biggest hit from what we call this big agribusiness sector. If we focus just on the food service has been the biggest hit across the state. And the numbers are almost astronomical that way. So over 21,000 jobs down as best as we can guess at this time, with over 500 million loss in just the payroll for this. It's going to be a big challenge going forward. Nobody knows exactly what to expect from this, which is why my last slide here, I just put, when people ask these questions all the time, what is going to happen when we reopen all this? The standard economist answer, it depends. We could use that one all day long. We're still up in the air as what the true impact is going to be the food industry and for how long in Oklahoma. And with that, Brent, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Holcomb. So at this time, we will take questions for any or all three of the presenters. Feel free to ask your questions in the chat box, and we will ask them and get them answered for you.
And Brent, while we're waiting for questions, I'll just make a comment that this has been a very common time for me to get requests. We need to start a cooperative packing plant or a cooperative something. And a lot of those ones, the issue is, well, we're hurting at the farm sector, so we're sure somebody else must be making all kinds of money right now. And so I guess if there was kind of a reminder that's flowing through this is that, you know, the fact that things are not rosy at the farm doesn't necessarily mean that some other sector is getting that. I think all of the whole supply chain is facing some issues. And so it's possible for the packer and the food processor and the cattle producer all simultaneously not to be doing too well.
Yeah, Phil, I will add, ironically, right before we started this webinar, I was responding to an email, another request from someone in Oklahoma saying, hey, I want to start a packing plant.
And also another thing, while you are thinking of questions, all right, here's one question for everyone. It said, everyone is posting on Facebook if our numbers include seaboard numbers. I'm guessing that they are not.
Yeah, so Arlene, I shared the article. There's actually several articles. The Guyman Seaboard plant has been kind of a poster child for the actual news media. So the national news media has been showing up there. The number I shared was the quarter of the actual Seaboard employees, not Texas County in general. So that number was Seaboard. I'm not sure what's happening on Facebook.
And then another question, are the providers for restaurants and grocery stores different, and has this been a problem in keeping up with food demand?
Yes, the providers for grocery stores and food service can be different. They may not always be different, but they can be different. So you can have restaurants that will buy plenty of their inputs from a Sam's wholesale warehouse, but they may also be getting a lot of food from U.S. Foods, Benny Keith, Cisco. You may have Associated Wholesale Grocers that's providing a lot of the transportation and warehouse logistics for a bunch of supermarkets. in Oklahoma. So they don't necessarily operate in the same circles, but there is some overlap. And you will see some food manufacturers that focus more on one than the other. So just as an example, National Steak and Poultry in Owasso, they're making steaks and chicken breasts, portion control cut, marinated, and quick frozen for use in food service. But they're not doing a whole lot in the retail sector. So they may be hit more than, say, JM Farms in Miami, who's doing mushrooms for both food service and for retail sale. And they tend to just shift the production focus from one to the other.
One of the biggest issues in making that shift are the packaging differences. So if you think about the cheese that a restaurant gets in a giant, 10-pound bag, if you've ever been to Sam's Club, you can also buy that 10-pound bag. Personally, I bought 10 pounds of bacon the other day because that's all they had. But the packaging is very, very different. And those machines are so specific that you can't just change from making, 10-pound bags of something to the 1-pound bag that you get in the store.
Courtney, just adding on that, since you mentioned cheese, the president of the Tillamook Cheese Company had a great comment, because one of the questions was, well, why are we dumping so much milk when we've got so many people that could use that milk right now? And why don't you just package the milk? And he said, listen, I may go through thousands and thousands of gallons of milk a day, but I can't just flip a switch and go from making 25-pound blocks of mozzarella cheese to making gallons of milk, bottling gallons of milk. It's not who we are. It's not what we do. That's an entirely different system. So it is a little different for anyone to go from what you would do for retail to what you do for food service, or even just down to the individual consumer.
And on our commodity side, the flour mills in Enid are selling flour in 1,000-pound totes, and then they're also set up to actually bag consumer bag parts of that, but they can't do the whole throughput in either one. So when you lose those restaurants needing 1,000, or food manufacturers needing 1,000 pounds, you can't just switch that into the store.
And we got another question as well. Are there any projections out there on the effects on farm income related to COVID-19?
Oh, I'm sure there are. Time will tell how accurate they are, but I'm sure people have taken a stab at that. Offhand, I couldn't send you to a link to tell you where to find that. And honestly, right now, because I'm on my phone, because I lost Wi-Fi connection, I couldn't dig up some of the ones I've looked at before and tell you where to go. Courtney, do you have anything on that?
No, I also have been watching in Oklahoma specifically. One of the main issues is separating the farm income that is coming from oil and gas and the farm income that is coming from crops or livestock. So a lot of things are happening simultaneously with COVID and the oil and gas industry having really, really low prices right now. So I think it's just going to take some time for everyone to sort of separate out those two things. But I haven't seen any. I'm sure there, like you said, I'm sure there are projections, but I haven't seen any that I really feel has captured everything that's happening and kind of parsed that out.
Certainly very commodity specific. I think cattle looks like a lot of impact. Soybean, just because what happens with the exports, look like new crop projections, their budgets looks a lot tougher. Wheat, not so much yet, and I really don't have a feel for what's going to happen with cotton. So that, it gets to the problem. It's going to hit, I think, each sector a little differently.
Well, if there are any other questions, please ask them at this time in the group and the chat window. And I would also like to ask everyone to give us a little feedback and help us know how we're doing by filling out the webinar survey. I did paste this link into the chat window as well for you to click on and fill it out. Does anyone have anything else to add before we wind up and wind down the webinar today? I would like to thank everyone for asking these good questions, and thank you, Dr. Burr and Dr. Kinkle and Dr. Holcomb, for presenting today. Thank you everyone for joining us in this webinar, and we have not scheduled our webinar for June yet, but that is in process now, so I will let everyone know once that date is set and topic is decided upon. So thanks again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.